Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That's as far as I get in German. I think the most important thing is to explain to you, as concisely as possible, how I came to feel that it was necessary to revise homeopathy. My father was a Kantian homeopath, and among his friends, I also knew some homeopaths who continued in the French school. In fact, these complex pluralists were quite a varied group, including Kantian unicists, and I could observe the different interpretations of what we call unicism. It so happens that there is not one single concept of unicism. There are many, to the point that I had to decide to revise all of them. There apparently being as many types of homeopathy as there were homeopaths. I started this task when I was very young, because I always felt that my vocation was medicine. I already enjoyed very detailed conversations with my father. We spoke in depth about all related matters. I can recall my first and very important phase, which is when I began to study medicine, simultaneously comparing what official traditional medicine said with what homeopathy said. I saw, for example, that many problems posed by traditional medicine couldn't be solved, but seen through the eyes of a homeopath, they were no longer problems. Later, when I began to work as a doctor, I started to study homeopathy more thoroughly, feeling I needed to do this to avoid excessive, as opposed to natural, influence from my father. He was a homeopath, and I had to understand homeopathy, and perhaps accept it. However, I did never accept it. I criticized it because I found that within its doctrine and its practice, there were too many contradictions. I found that Hahnemann contradicted himself, as well as contradicting his biggest followers, such as Kant and Allen. There was also a certain aspect of homeopathy that one rejected after having trained as a traditional doctor. That aspect was that Hahnemann and his followers were very evidently religious. This was unavoidable in their attitude, and made me have to choose if this metaphysical philosophy was an element not worthy of influencing medical studies. Or could I criticize and analyze their doctrine and feel sure it was based on fact, rather than a caprice of personal beliefs? One factor that greatly influenced my reaction was that my own father was unable to explain what religion had to do with medicine, which in fact caused a certain separation within the Kantian group.
Posición que había dado origen a una cierta separación entre un grupo de kantianos era que
their conclusion was to claim that whatever was said about the religious aspect, illness in people couldn't be understood without considering their spiritual aspect. At this point, I embarked on a second phase in my investigations. Hahnemann, Kant, Bonninghausen, Alan Fatak, etc., were all people whose powerful intelligence as doctors had been well demonstrated to me that they're absolutely medical aspects. So there had to be a reason why they talked as they did. I was intent on finding that reason and being able to determine if it was justified or was indeed an illusion caused by a mistaken interpretation on the part of these doctors. Therefore, and I suppose with no little audacity, I began the critical analysis of these homeopath religious statements. Well, I won't give you a step-by-step account of how my research has developed, except about certain aspects. I can tell you that when I concluded I had achieved a very clear result. The fact that we were dealing with two medicines that had been considered to be only one. Here's where I found the origin of the many confusions to be noted in homeopathic thought. Another consideration of mine at this point was my decision not to take into account any other discipline aside from homeopathy in my analysis. For example, I had come across a considerable current of thought in disaccord with Hahnemann, and had seen that in the dark corners of homeopathy there was an attempt to clarify things from an orthodox Freudian point of view. Another sector claimed to understand dark doubts in homeopathy using analysis based on cytological vision, meaning that what happened to the cell happened to the whole human being. Here too there were contradictions, although in truth I'd say that in this current what I found was a lack of real knowledge of biology and cytology. which gave rise to absolutely wrong conclusions.
Entonces, ¿cuál era
So,
la causa de
what was
esta
the
mezcla
reason for the mixture
de
of
dos
these two
cosas
things?
que parecían ser muy distintas
Obviously very different in their scope
en su alcance, en su profundidad
and in
de
their
visión
depth of vision of
de la
illness.
enfermedad? Sí, dos aspectos distintos
These two different aspects didn't evolve together.
desde un punto de vista evolutivo. Es decir, una cosa
I mean that one
resultaba
turned
ser
out to be the first phase of Hahnemann's investigations,
la primera etapa de las investigaciones de Hahnemann, y otra cosa su segunda etapa.
and the other was his second phase.
Bueno, ¿qué es lo que justificaba que no se
So,
hubiera
what
separado
justified
claramente
not
la
having
primera
clearly
etapa
overcome
de
the
la
first
segunda
phase with the
etapa?
second?
Las ideas de la primera con las
The
ideas de la
ideas
segunda.
of the first phase with those of the second.
Esta característica de evolución permanente
This is the
del
characteristic
pensamiento
of
y la
permanent
experimentación
evolution
de
in Hahnemann's thought and experimentation.
Y allí vemos tres cosas fundamentales
And here we see
que
three
tenemos
basic
que
things that we should observe
precisar y
and give
subrayar.
importance to.
Primero, en la medida que va progresando,
Firstly, as Hahnemann
Hahnemann
progresses,
pasa de experimentar
he ceases to experiment or to cure with medicines consisting in
con
material
materia a experimentar con
and begins to
energía.
experiment with pure energy,
Supera en las dinamizaciones el número de abogados.
overcoming Avogadro's
En
dynamizations of
este
the number.
aspecto,
In this respect,
Hahnemann
Hahnemann
se da
realizes
cuenta que algo ha ocurrido,
that something has occurred,
pero él no conocía el
but
número
is
de Avogadro.
unaware of
No
Avogadro's
conocía que
number.
existía un límite para la capacidad
He
de
doesn't know
dispersión máxima
that there is a
de
limit to
la
the
materia.
capacity of maximum, regulable
Pero lo
dispersion of
señala.
matter, though he refers to
En el
it.
parágrafo 270,
He's adamant in paragraph 270, where he gives a clear impression
que
that what we use
aquello que utilizamos ha cambiado,
changes
que se ha metamorfoseado
and metamorphosizes
en algo, por así decir, espiritual.
in something we may call spiritual.
Pero Hahnemann carece
But Hahnemann
del
lacks
elemento
the element that could
que le
have given
podría
him
haber dado
more
certeza.
certainty.
Sí, señor.
Yes,
Cuando en
sir.
vez de experimentar con
When
la
I
sexta,
perform
experimento con la
the
30,
experiment
ya
with
no estoy
the
utilizando
CH16
materia
instead of
porque he superado el
CH30,
número de Avogadro.
I'm no longer
Cuando
using
conozca esa
material
certeza,
because I
no
have
puedo
surpassed
ser más
Avogadro's
determinante.
number. He never had
Ni
that
siquiera
certainty. He
consigo
couldn't be
mismo.
more conclusive, even within
Y
himself.
no revisó
Nor did he
a la luz de
investigate,
lo que le
in the
decía
light of how his
nuevas
new
comprobaciones
findings
anteriores.
compared with the previous ones.
Entonces deja mezclado
So he left the meaning
el
of experimentation with matter all
de la
mixed up
experimentación
with the results of
por
experimentation with
materia
energy,
y los resultados de la experimentación.
thus providing us with one of the worst obstacles in the way of understanding
Uno
homeopathy.
de los resultados de más pesada repercusión en la comprensión de la homeopatía proviene de esto, que es cuando Hahnemann comienza a ver que cuanto más diluye,
Next, Hahnemann starts to observe that the more he dilutes,
disminuye el número
the
de
less
experimentadores
sensitive
sensibles.
experimenters he has.
Y entonces elucubra los parágrafos sobre
So he imagines the paragraphs about idiosyncrasy,
Pero ese es uno de los puntos que
but
marca
this is
la
one of the
diferencia
points that shows the
entre
difference between his first and second studies.
Entre la primera etapa de Hahnemann y la segunda. Yo le llamo la segunda.
From an experimental point of view, I call the second stage the one when he experiments only with energy. The second difference that Hahnemann leaves confirmed is that along with this decrease in the number of sensitive experimenters, there's something very important. He sees that previously the sequence of first and second effect was performed. Then when he begins to work with high dynamizations, very high for his time, obviously he finds that the first effect and the second effect disappear. He takes note of this but cannot find an explanation. This means that he can't use it as an element to make the conceptual separation of what happens. The third difference is important too, because it is also the cause of another of Hahnemann's obscurities. It's the fact that as he does experiments with more dynamized substances, the nature of the symptoms that he registered changed totally. That's to say, that in the first phase, when he experimented with matter, he saw there were physiopathological syndromes as a result of the experiment. He said this was very important because with insensible matter, as had happened by modifying the remedy, the criteria of the illness is modified. In this second phase, Hahnemann goes increasingly into depth about non-pathological illness. For example, instead of a headache, he considers great sensitivity to humid days. This was not pathological from the traditional point of view as an anatomical clinical entity. Here he makes very important progress with the concept of clinical illness, so to speak, when he says that the most important thing is the mode and not the pathonomic aspect. But at this point he gets no further. That's to say, he doesn't distance himself from the non-biological entity. For example, he values the fact that in this patient, pain irradiates to the right and not to the left, as was the case in another patient, though the pain in both cases is provoked by a clinical entity, an ulcer. He continues his evolution while senselessly avoiding the blatant pathological evidence, though he never loses sight of it, which is what later causes him to contradict himself so as to justify the results of his first phase with those of his second. And he mixes the idea of clinical illness with the idea of individual illness, which is what he'd been discovering. For example,
resultados
with all
experimentales
those experimental
que lo
results
llevan
that led him to see
a ver
how
cada vez de
important the
manera
individual
más
is,
importante a la individualidad. Él trata de, como les digo, justificar
let's say that he
todo
tries
como
to
si
justify
fuera una
everything
sola cosa.
as if it were only one
Y
thing.
entonces,
And in this case,
estando trabajando con lo que llamó psora, es decir,
he's working
una
with what I call
enfermedad
sora,
que no es de la
which denotes an
patología
illness
tradicional,
not of the traditional pathological type.
mantiene una larga lista
He maintains a long list of
de entidades
important clinical
clínicas bien
entities
lesionales como si fueran la psora.
as if they were the sora.
Lo cual provoca, o
And in what I'm explaining,
encontramos la
we find the
justificación de
justification
una
of the contradictions
contradicción
between
entre
Hahnemann, Allen, and Kant.
y Ken. Porque Ken y Allen
Allen and Kant
le quitan a la psora
don't
todo
consider that the
poder
sora has any power
lesional.
to cause harm,
La psora es una etapa,
meaning
un
that the sora
momento
is a phase or a moment
que va a condicionar la aparición de lo
that is
patológico.
going to condition the appearance of a pathology,
Entonces ellos también
while
son
not being
terminantes. La
pathological
psora
in
no
itself.
provoca lesión.
However,
Entonces,
they are
todo
definitive.
estos tres grandes
The sora doesn't
parámetros
provoke
que les he
lesions.
nombrado,
Well, these three great
al no ser
parameters I've
separados
talked
por
of
Hahnemann,
remain
dejan
unseparated by
una
Hahnemann.
sola medicina
He noted only one medicine,
donde hay en realidad
when in reality there are two different medicines.
lo cual trae una segunda consecuencia,
That caused a second consequence,
que cuando
which
un
is
médico
that when a doctor
lee la obra homeopática,
reads a homeopathic work,
tiene una tendencia
he or she has a
espontánea
spontaneous
a quedarse con
tendency
aquello más parecido
to
a lo que le
stick with what
enseñaron
is
en la
most
facultad,
similar to what was taught at
que es lo
university,
nuevo y revolucionario. Hasta este momento
discarding the new,
no había intervenido
revolutionary
para
aspects.
nada
Until this point, I
en
had
la revisión
absolutely
crítica
never intervened by means of critical revision in the
del aspecto
aspect
o el
or
análisis
analysis
de las opiniones
of
filosóficas,
philosophical,
religiosas,
religious, or metaphysical opinions.
¿Qué ocurría?
But as I've said,
Que había como les dije, un tercer elemento
there was a third
de
element of confusion
confusión o mezclado.
and of mixing, as I'll now
Es decir,
explain.
Hahnemann comienza con su rebelión
Hahnemann began his rebellion
contra
against the
el caos
chaos
de la patología
of
de
pathology
su
of his
época,
time,
las teorías, la enfermedad es esto, la enfermedad es aquello,
its
la mezcla de
theories, the
humores.
definition of illness,
Para cortar con todas estas especulaciones,
the mixture of humours needed to have done with all these
¿qué hace desde el
speculations.
punto de vista de su posición?
But what did he do from the point of view of his
Adopta una
position?
posición estrictamente
He adopted a
positivista,
strictly positivist
que ustedes
position,
lo habrán visto en muchas partes
such
del
as you will have
organismo
seen in many
de
parts of the organon
No se puede conocer
of chronic illnesses,
la esencia de la
where
enfermedad.
one can't know the
Solo
essence
podemos
of the
conocer
illness. One can only
por
know
sus resultados,
the results or
fenómenos o
phenomenons or the
síntomas. Pero
symptoms,
la esencia de la enfermedad no.
but
Y otra
not the
vez
essence of the
aparece
illness.
esa evolución lenta,
Once again, this slow,
progresiva,
progressive evolution can be observed,
que hace que ni el mismo
and
Hahnemann se dé
Hahnemann
cuenta de
himself is unable to even realize it.
Porque si él podía tomar la decisión, no puedo conocer la
He cannot know the
esencia
essence
de
of
cáncer.
cancer, but
Pero
little by
poco a
little,
poco, sus nuevas
his new
experimentaciones
experiments with the appearance
con la aparición de sintomatología
of
no
symptomatology,
perteneciente a la patología,
not pertaining to pathology,
le plantea problemas
pose
que
him
no
problems
puede
that he
resolver.
can't solve and that worry him increasingly.
Entonces comienza a tratar de encontrar una explicación
Here,
por las causas
he
primeras.
begins to try to find an explanation for the first causes.
Positivista a filósofo. Entonces,
That's to say, from having been a positivist, he becomes a philosopher. This is what happens. It is the essence, is what explains the confusion that Hahnemann has caused for homeopaths. He's a positivist and a philosopher, performing experiments that we can consider as intoxications, while other experiments evidently exalt idiosyncrasy. I therefore had to separate this and stop searching. Why confuse myself with this mixture and everything produced by his first phase? I left it aside. Actum. Though without devaluating it, because, well, because it's what we do every day, since we can't normally do anything else. I mean, the more we know that this is the ideal that homeopathy offers, which is to consider that the true essence of illness is sensitivity, susceptibility and vulnerability in a specific human being. Logically, when faced with an acute appendicitis, considering the sore and trying to find the ideal medicine, which we'll probably never find, aren't we going to prescribe a homeopathic remedy that covers the local symptomatology and that we know to be effective? There are a few cases where the ideal medicine might be considered to be discovered during an acute condition, but this is infrequent. And we can offer a much better therapy without using what I personally call homeopathy of the future. A better therapy than allopathy. It's a question of common sense. If I can cure a pneumonia without antibiotics, using a medicine with no side effects, although it may not be the patient's similimum remedy, I obtain the second great result, absolutely by chance. I mean, by finding the unity, coherence, and motive of all the philosophical opinions that Hahnemann expressed. But Hahnemann spoke so much about the soul that I had to ask myself, what did I myself know about the soul? Then I realized that I knew nothing. I just accepted its existence and went no further. I valued it as the most important aspect of the human being, so I decided to study the soul, which is done by means of psychology. Now, I had another acute problem because psychology was in even more of a chaos than homeopathy. I saw that I must go back to the roots, instead of confusing myself with the modern psychological schools. I decided to start by looking at an aspect which, to my knowledge, hasn't yet been truly studied. Scholastic psychology. Here you find an enormous philosophical wealth, and very specifically included in the scholastic aspects, you find a large part dedicated to psychology, conceived as a science of life, which indeed was its first meaning. Well, I did it. I did that, and what did I start to find? As St. Thomas says, in his opinion and definitive truth, the panorama opened even more widely. This occurred because I was obliged to study St. Thomas of Aquino. Here, I'd like to stress how I changed so much in this aspect. I mean, I didn't set out with knowledge of homeopathy. When I was already a Thomist. I arrived the opposite way, from pure homeopathy, without any Thomistic speculations. Now, referring to the Summa Theologica, question 91, article 3, and the reply to objection number 2 of the first part, St. Thomas tells us that man is the most defenseless of all creatures, because he's born without a thick skin, without claws, or powerful teeth, but that to compensate for these deficiencies, God bestowed him with a spirit and with hands. When I read this, I knew I read it before, but not by Thomas de Aquino. I realized I had read it by Hahnemann, but where exactly? So I read all of Hahnemann again, and finally arrived at the article called The Medicine of Experience. It's an article rather than a book. He wrote many articles. They're in a collection of his lesser writings. I find that Hahnemann writes, right here he says, because of all creatures, man is born with the least defenses, because he has no claws, no fur, no thick skin. But to compensate for these deficiencies, God Almighty gave him his spirit and his hands. The only difference is that he gives more examples of the lack of defenses, to the point that I'm not ashamed to say that Hahnemann plagiarizes. The person who quotes another person without saying whom he's quoting plagiarizes. At this point I feel my revision to be of great importance, and wonder if all that is unclear in Hahnemann could perhaps be explained by considering him a Thomist. Effectively, I found that my rereading of him in the light of his being a Thomist made everything so much clearer.
Todo lo que antes era oscuro se aclaraba. No lo niego, no lo
I
niego,
don't
que
deny
puede
that
ser,
it could be only
pero lo que es
coincidence.
difícil es que lo expresen con
It
palabras
could be so, but that's
idénticas.
difficult
Por otra parte,
when it's a word-for-word quote.
al seguir el estudio en paralelo de Hahnemann y de Santo
Again,
Tomás,
considering my study of Hahnemann
encontré
on a
muchas
parallel with
otras
St. Thomas,
cosas tan similares
I
de un
found
pensamiento
many
y
other
otro
things as
como la
similar
primera.
between their
Por
thoughts
ejemplo,
as that example is.
Hahnemann plantea
Another example is that Hahnemann states
que el hombre tiene un fin último
that man
y
has
que
an
ese
ultimate
fin
end,
último
fin ultimo,
consiste en aproximarse
which
a
is
Dios,
his approach
no
to God.
convertirse en Dios. Atención, es importante.
Note that he doesn't say a
Y eso
conversion
lo
into
puede
God.
lograr por sensaciones que le den bienestar,
This is important, this approach to God.
por la
It can be
ejecución de
achieved by
acciones que
sensations
exalten su
that give you
dignidad, la
well-being,
ejecución de acciones que exalten la dignidad,
having performed good deeds,
y la adquisición
exalted your
de
dignity,
conocimientos
accumulated
que abarquen
knowledge
el
of the
universo. Y leyendo
universe.
así toda la obra, vemos que Hahnemann
Reading all of Hahnemann's work in this light,
no pretende intervenir
we see that he doesn't try to
en la
medically
adquisición de
intervene
conocimiento.
in the
Es decir, se
acquisition
limita
of
a
knowledge.
decir que la medicina
He limits himself to
ayuda al
saying
hombre en este fin
that medicine helps
porque
man
le
at this
devuelve
ultimate
las
end
sensaciones que lo hacen
because it
gozar de
revives his
bienestar y
sensations
le facilita
of well-being,
entonces
which
ejecutar
help him to do
acciones que
deeds
exalten su
that
dignidad.
exalt his
Es
dignity.
la devolución
It's the
por medio del
return
similio
through the similimum of
de
utter
una
liberty
máxima libertad
and freedom
del
of
libre albedrío,
choice.
valga la redundancia. Es decir, al comienzo de esa
I mean,
pareja que usted cita,
the beginning of
son
that
llevados
pair you spoke of,
a una actitud contraria a la
they're
salud
led to
de Hahnemann
a contrary
por
attitude
las tendencias.
regarding health.
Y el simillimum modera, disminuye o
Hahnemann
hace
sees that in
desaparecer
some
las tendencias no naturales.
tendencies, and the similimum is moderated,
Hablando a nivel de simillimum, no existe nada,
decreased or
nada que lo
makes
equivoque.
unnatural tendencies disappear.
Cuando caí en la cuenta de esta realidad,
The
obtuve una
similimum
gran
has no
libertad
antidote.
terapéutica. Incluso evité
When I
el
assimilated this
ponerlo en la
reality,
angustia al enfermo.
I found a great
Pero las
therapeutic
drogas sí no
liberty,
entiendo.
which even avoids
Yo he
anguish for
visto,
the
por
patient.
ejemplo, pacientes
I've seen, for example,
tomando 6,
patients
7 tipos
taking
distintos de
6 or 7 different types of psychopharmaceutic
sin
medicine
prohibirle nada ni decirle
because I'd started the
nada.
treatment without
Y
telling
veo
them
que
not
si
to
le he
take
dado
this
el
or that
similio,
pill.
espontáneamente el
And now I
enfermo
saw
va
that
dejando
if they
el
had
psicofármaco.
spontaneously
Ellos se lo piden
experienced the similimum,
exactamente igual que
they
los
themselves stopped taking such pills without my having asked them to do so.
contándome la evolución que han tenido.
Exactly the same as
Me
happens
dice
with
el enfermo,
tobacco.
otra cosa que le va a interesar,
The
doctor.
patients have told me, by the way,
Estoy
doctor,
fumando mucho menos.
I'm smoking much
¿Por qué se
less.
lo propuso? ¿Hizo alguna
When I asked them if
promesa?
this was because of some
¿Por
sort of
qué
promise,
decidió
they said,
fumar menos?
no,
No, porque no tengo ganas.
I just don't feel like smoking much.
Bueno, pero volviendo al tema de Hahnemann y
Well,
Santo Tomás,
returning to the theme of Hahnemann and St. Thomas,
si ustedes, después de leer este aspecto de Esculapio en la balanza,
there's an article he
el
wrote called
aspecto
the
del penúltimo, de cuál es el penúltimo,
Esculapio in the Balance, regarding the theme of the ultimate end.
Escritos que se llama Esculapio en la balanza. Sí, en esa parte Hahnemann habla así.
With an aspect he never mentions in the
Y si
organelle.
ustedes toman los capítulos dedicados
You can compare this work with St. Thomas of Aquino's
al
chapters
fin último del
on
hombre,
the ultimate end,
es decir, que va emparentado con muchas normas morales
and
empezadas
find
por
many
Hahnemann,
moral standards
porque
that
implica la
Hahnemann
evolución
states later
espiritual.
when implying spiritual evolution. We could call this the enteleche. You've seen that Hahnemann. But you've seen that Hahnemann has merely resumed what St. Thomas says, while St. Thomas goes into much more detail.
Se plantea de una manera mucho más minuciosa que Hahnemann. Si el hombre
Does man have an ultimate end? Does he have more than one ultimate end, and if so,
si el hombre tiene más de un fin último, y la parte
which
que
part is
diríamos más
more
nos interesa
medically
médicamente,
interesting?
También se plantea en otra cuestión de la suma.
In another question with regard to the Summa, he asks if the body is necessary to obtain the ultimate end, if a healthy body is necessary.
Y responde por la afirmativa.
He replies that it is.
Y así después está el fin último.
In the context of his questioning, if the ultimate end, fin ultimo, for man is to obtain power, money, the pleasures of the flesh.
Hahnemann en un otro, esta vez creo que era un periódico.
Meanwhile, well, I'm not sure, but I think it was in a newspaper he published called The Friend of Health. Hahnemann says,
Dice, me da pena el hombre.
I feel pity for a man when I see him dedicate himself to attaining riches, power, what lust? So again, he's inspired by St. Thomas. It's also understandable to see Hahnemann as a Thomist when reading the preface of the fourth edition of the Organon. That's where it is clearest, more so than in the chronic illnesses, in the expression upon what illness is. At this point he says that illness is the morbid alteration of the vital force. And what we call illness, that's to say clinical entity, is the miserable and generally useless effort that the organism makes to cure this morbid influence on the vital force. This implies a positivity in the pathological and clinical aspects as a beginning in the direction of the curation process. In that preface to the fourth edition of the Organon, Hahnemann says that the true illness is the morbid effect on our vital force. What exactly do we mean by illness? Pneumonia or appendicitis are no more than miserable and usually useless efforts to try and cure this morbid effect. Meaning that the clinical aspect has a positive sense, although it doesn't seem to have. And Hahnemann also says, referring to this problem, don't respect the vis medicatrice. He says this in a synonym, but respect it.
pero
That's to
respétela.
say, what nature does, you have to respect it,
Es una
but
paradoja.
you don't
Es decir,
contradict it either.
lo que hace la
So what do we
naturaleza
find? We find
no
that
lo
the
respeta,
clinical aspect
pero
doesn't reach its end.
tampoco lo contradiga. Es decir, prácticamente deje hacer. Es una paradoja. Entonces, ¿qué encontramos? Que si la entidad clínica aparece, como no termina su camino, provoca
It provokes the
la
anatomical pathology or the
anatomía
physiopathology.
patológica o la fisiopatología. Es decir,
He also
que
says
está
that as doctors,
yendo en una dirección positiva, pero no llega. Y dice también que
we shouldn't imitate nature.
en nuestra acción de médicos
That's
no
why I said paradoxical.
imitemos a la naturaleza.
We don't imitate it, we leave it alone.
Por eso les decía que es paradojal. No la imite, pero déjela.
In the Thomist anthropology,
tenemos que
this
en este
aspect
aspecto,
includes
el hombre pierde lo que se llama
man losing his
los
so-called
dones
preternatural
preternaturales.
gifts.
¿Cuáles son esos
And
dones
what are these preternatural
preternaturales
gifts that man had
que el hombre tenía antes de la
before he
transgresión
disobeyed the law?
de la
For
desobediencia a la
example,
ley?
immunity is the transgression of paradise or whatever you wish to call it.
Entonces, pierde la
So,
inmunidad,
man loses immunity,
pierde más específicamente la
or more specifically, he loses integrity.
Es decir,
What
que
is this integrity in the case of a man?
en el caso de que el hombre pudiera
A
ser
man being
herido por
wounded by
algo,
something,
tenía en sí mismo todo lo necesario para
when he had
curarse
in
a
himself
sí
everything
mismo.
necessary to cure
Además,
at
perdió la
interim.
inmortalidad, lógicamente, y la ciencia infusa. Entonces
Logically,
entendemos
he
la
also
paradoja.
lost his immortality, and science infuses. To
La
understand the
patología
paradox,
tiene
the pathology
una
takes a good direction,
buena y
and we
tenemos
must
que
try as
tratar
much
en
as
lo
possible
posible
not to contradict it,
de no contrariarla, aunque a veces no tenemos más
although
remedio
at
como
times as
médicos que
doctors we
hacerlo.
can't avoid doing so.
Fíjense que va cambiando mucho
Look how many changes there have been
lo que nos dice la medicina,
in what traditional medicine tells us.
porque después de que han sacado millones, por así decir,
They've
de
removed
próstatas,
millions of prostrates,
ahora
but
prácticamente no lo
nowadays
operan. Y parece que quienes siguen esa
they
escuela
really operate
tienen
them
estadísticas muy
and tell us that the
mejor
results are more
que
positive
antes
nowadays than before.
que en la época operatoria. Entonces, vemos allí, una vez más, la
Here
identidad
again we
del
see the
pensamiento.
identity of thought.
Santo Tomás, que nos habla de
Saint
la
Thomas, who
pérdida de
tells
esos
us of the
dones,
loss of these gifts, And Hahnemann, who describes as Thomas thought without speaking directly about it.
Ese pensamiento tomista. Hay otras pruebas.
There are other proofs.
Ejemplo,
for example,
que
a
Hahnemann utiliza
phrase from St. Thomas that Hahnemann uses all the time
una frase de
about
Santo Tomás,
human
que
nature,
es la humana naturaleza
human nature
abandonada,
abandoned to itself.
abandonada. Le han quitado, se la deja sola
You
a
leave
la
nature alone.
naturaleza. Y entonces le empiezan
And
los
man begins to have
trastornos al hombre.
traumas.
La humana
Man's nature
naturaleza,
deteriorates
la
when left alone
naturaleza
without
del
help.
hombre, dejada sola, sin un auxilio,
It becomes ill.
degrada. Si
In the light of all
agregamos
this
considerarlo a Hahnemann como tomista,
finalistic feeling in the work of St. Thomas,
todo el
we can consider
sentido finalista
Hahnemann to be a Thomist.
Finalista es esto.
Man must do different things on different vegetable levels, on sensitive and spiritual levels. And nature always gives him all he needs to live up to these expectations. There's nothing useless in the organism. And if we find this in a general way,
y si lo tomamos de manera más general,
you finally understand Hahnemann's profound thought when he writes in paragraph 15,
cuando escribe el parágrafo 15. No, perdón, el parágrafo
there's no pardon for paragraph 9, where the vital force maintains a balanced harmony. Finally, the spirit, with its gift of reason, that we all have within us, reaches the elevated end of existence. Meaning, in this way, our spirit can make use of these live and healthy instruments in its achievement of the elevated end of existence.
¿A qué nos lleva esto? Que la salud no está porque sí.
This leads Hahnemann to think that health exists as a function in order to reach the elevated end of existence.
Salud está para cumplir una función, los altos fines de la existencia. Sí, el hombre
if a man doesn't take care of his health
no aprovecha la salud
and ensure he's in continual good health,
para continuar,
that misused health will deteriorate and atrophy.
la salud no utilizada
So again and again I insist,
se atrofia y degenera. Entonces,
it's fundamental that my position is clear to you. When I speak of St. Thomas of Aquino, everybody starts to discuss his work. But that's not the point. It's my conclusion that's important.
No es la vía de la polémica. Si me quieren discutir, tienen que discutir mi conclusión.
Hahnemann does nothing but
Hahnemann no
explain
hace otra
medicine
cosa que
by means of anthropological Thomism.
explicar la medicina
There are just
por la
3 lines of
antropología.
legitimate
Se
discussion
abren
here.
3 caminos de discusión legítima.
Firstly,
Primero,
that Masi is confused,
Masi se ha
that
confundido.
Hahnemann never says anything
Hahnemann
similar to
nunca
St.
dice
Thomas.
nada similar a Santo Tomás. Segundo,
Secondly,
Hahnemann dice
Hahnemann says
algo que
something
parece
similar
ser
to
de
St.
Santo
Thomas,
Tomás. Pero si estudiamos
but
a
if we
fondo a
read
Santo
St. Thomas
Tomás,
thoroughly,
vemos que jamás ha dicho
we'll
nada
find that he never
parecido a
said
Hahnemann.
anything similar to
Y lo
Hahnemann.
tercero es admitimos lo que dice el doctor
Thirdly, we
Masi.
accept what Dr. Masi
Hahnemann,
says.
Hahnemann y Santo
Hahnemann
Tomás
and St. Thomas both say the
dicen
same
lo
things.
mismo. Pero los dos se
And
equivocan.
both are wrong.
Pero no me digan a mí. Yo jamás he
Now, I've never
pretendido
tried to force an interpretation.
forzar la interpretación.
What
Yo he
interested
llegado
me
a
was finding the
encontrar
model of man with which
cuál es el
Hahnemann
modelo
works.
de hombre con el que trabaja Hahnemann. Y era lo que a mí me interesaba. Vayan a discutir
It seems that
Hahnemann.
what happened in all congresses is
Pero
that people
no,
say,
¿qué ocurre? En todos los congresos empieza a aparecer.
Masi wants to present
Masi
a
quiere
Judeo-Christian homeopathy,
presentar una
or it's
homeopatía
Hahnemann who
judeocristiana.
presents it.
No, el que presenta una homeopatía judeocristiana es Hahnemann. ¿Por qué?
Because his
Porque le
intelligence
satisface
of the
a la
anthropological
inteligencia
model of
el
Aristotle
modelo
and St. Thomas is
antropológico de
satisfied.
Aristóteles y de Santo Tomás de Aquino, y
So there's
no,
no betrayal of
entonces
Hahnemann's
que no
thoughts.
traicionen el
This is
pensamiento
the
de Hahnemann.
orthodoxy
Esto
of
es
his
la
anthropological
ortodoxia del
thought.
pensamiento antropológico de Hahnemann.
In fact, this isn't
¿Por
my
qué lo
view, and
dijo
it isn't
ahora?
my
Ya
problem.
no es mi tema. No es mi problema. Yo llegué a descubrir la
I discovered
ortodoxia.
the orthodoxy,
Si a partir de
and if
allí
anybody wants to say that
alguien quiere
homeopathy and
decir
its
que la
anthropological
homeopatía
model are wrong,
y su modelo antropológico se
I
equivocan,
accept the
admito la discusión.
discussion.
Pero no
But there's
admito
an
la
aspect
discusión.
that I don't
Entonces,
accept.
que esto quede bien claro. Por ejemplo, como
I want
les
this
decía
to
al
be very
principio,
clear.
he
For example, as
visto
I've said earlier,
comentaristas de la
I've seen
homeopatía
comments on homeopathy
como Pasquero y como Sánchez
by
Ortega,
Pachero or Santos Ortega,
que en contra de toda
who
evidencia,
against all the evidence
de una posición de
of
Hahnemann,
Hahnemann's clearly theist position,
netamente teísta en lo religioso. Tanto Pasquero como Sánchez Ortega lo presentan como
they both
panteísta.
consider him a pantheist.
En contra de todo lo que dice el mismo Hahnemann. ¿Cómo lo han
How
leído?
much must they have read him, and how did they conclude
Para
this?
decir esas afirmaciones. Entonces, para irnos a hacer un relax, les vuelvo a
I like to
repetir
repeat
como resultado de la
that in a
revisión
clinical
clínica,
revision,
la necesidad de separar homeopatía
it's necessary to see the difference between homeopathy and homeotherapy.
El tomismo de Hahnemann y el análisis
The discovery of Thomism in Hahnemann and the critical analysis leading to the conclusion, without just now explaining, which would be very long, that there aren't three miasmas, there is only one entity that we can call the Sora. The unbalancing of vital force, the existential anguish of every human being. So much has been written about the three miasmas, but we mustn't despair.
Mucho tiempo de exposición.
I'm going to dedicate the time that the Frankfurt Congress has given me, and I'm going to try to show you the existence in Hahnemann's own work of this one and only illness. If you wish, a third stage of this work can be made up of answering a few questions.
Responder a algunas preguntas, lo cual no es otra cosa que clasificar.
It's a case of miasmatically classifying symptoms and themes. Why didn't I include storic themes, syphilitic or psychotic themes, as they used to say? Because of the existing gap between different schools. So this work couldn't be used by a student who read Escape among the classified syphilitic symptoms. The doctor in question was from Sanchez Ortega's school, because for them, escape is psychotic. So then I forgot the miasmatic names and asked for a classification in reply to these questions. How is the remedy suffered? What's the suffering? Second question. How are the patient's defensives when he chooses escape, retreat, non-combat? Third question. How are his defenses when he chooses attack, the destruction of the other? Now what's the next question, the fourth one? How are his defenses when he decides to win and assert himself? Are they frank or are they a disguise? Well, as you can see, the questions are the symptomatology of psoric suffering. For the first, the symptomatology of the egolytic attitude, the symptomatology of the alter lysis of frank and self-disguising egotrophy. I mean, this phase of the work is the basic miasmatic classification, considering that all those different phases were moments concerning just one thing, one unity.
Having
Having done this classification work, There's a new classification of symptoms. I mean the symptoms to be found in our anthropological scheme. The themes and symptoms included. Symptoms on a rational level, intellectual symptoms, symptoms of willingness, symptoms of the conceptual memory. After that, there are symptoms of the sensitive sphere. So for the knowing aspect of sensitivity, the symptomatology of the senses of external knowledge, we wonder if the pathogenesis showed the symptomatology of the eyes, the hearing, taste, smell, and touch. If there were symptoms that indicated problems in the internal sense of knowledge, well, the senses of knowledge are divided between internal and external. The internal ones are common sense, whose function is to correlate information from the exterior ones. This means passing from sensation to perception, of course. Sensation comes first, but it enters in such an absolute way. If you want me to be specific, for example, the eye can establish a difference between black and white. It can't establish a correlation, however, between black, white, and the sensation transmitted by the other sense. For example, soft. So now, common sense comes in to join and to compare. A simple example. The eye tells me green, touch tells me soft, round, taste tells me bittersweet. Common sense tells me apple. This common sense, as soon as it says apple, transmits the image apple with its name apple onto the imagination, so that the image can be saved there. The imagination has a superior sphere, and it establishes a scale of values. Let's say that it separates that other internal feeling. It keeps it joined to the imagination because in reality it forms part of the imagination. It establishes good apple tasty, nutritive, and keeps it there. If in the future I need apple, I have the other internal sentiment, which is a memory of something concrete, which lets me know that what I need and want is the apple. We name this the inferior reason. All this mechanism because it relates to concrete things. What I need to survive and to maintain the species on the planet. Once we reach knowledge of the object, what happens? On the same sensitive level, the appetite is activated. In fact, there are two kinds of appetite. We call the first one the concupiscible or the lustful appetite, which makes me want something. For example, we reach knowledge of the values of an object, and if this tells me that the object is good, the passion of love awakens in me on seeing the object, in the sense of valuing the object. So if it's good, I love it, and if it's bad, my opposite passion is awoken, my hatred. These functions are the ones that enable us to know the knowledgeable aspect of the sensitive sphere. Passions vary according to if the object is present, if it's absent, if I had it but didn't make use of it. So if it's present, but I still haven't had it, I haven't enjoyed it, we've got love if it's good, hate if it's bad, and if it's absent and I evoke its idea, we've got desire for what's good, aversion of what's bad. Then there's another appetite that has been named the irascible appetite. Half of it is concupiscible and half is irascible. What is the function of the irascible aspect? The function of the irascible aspect is to battle with the obstacles that the concupiscible or lustful aspect has on the way to completing its mission. That's why I'm defining it, and there's another thing, which is that I'm using medieval scholastic language, of course, so that it's not common. There must be some way of saying it in German. Let's see if within the material I have symptoms of hate, symptoms of being overwhelmed, symptoms of aversion, symptoms of hope, symptoms of fury. We could call them the passions of the soul. In passing, I'll tell you that the passions of the soul are not in themselves morally good or bad. So let's have no confusion there. They are forces, functions that we've been given in order to reach our impossible objective. We find the pathological aspect of what we're looking for in the symptomatology. When the deformation that I have in my imagination, which is the soric problem, makes me react excessively when confronted with a certain object, or else not react to it when I should react, or react with mistaken passion. That's to say, for example, I see an object as bad when everyone else sees it as good. I'm reacting with mistaken passion. Another example. That could be aversion to a member of the family, I'm reacting with mistaken passion to someone I should love.
Ahora, el trabajo del médico en este sentido es muy bien en la generalidad de
Well, in most cases, one ought to love one's family.
este
This patient
paciente
hates his
no
family,
tendrá razón
so
el
could his family actually be bad?
y su familia es mala.
Could the patient be right? Now there's a practical example, very pertinent to this theme because it draws our attention to how right Hahnemann was. This was when he asked for the interrogation of the relatives, friends, and people close to the patient so that we could have objective information. A colleague once presented us the case of a child who from the first consultation said, "Mummy is bad." And the colleague said that the child had progressed very well in all his problems, his illnesses, his general state, his mental state. But in the midst of this enormous improvement, the one thing that hadn't changed was that this child hadn't stopped saying, "Mummy is bad." The colleague added that after he got to know Mummy as a patient, he realized the child was right. Mummy was bad. Well, let's look for the symptoms. We'll classify them according to their vegetative strengths. See what symptoms there are. For example, the appetite, nutrition, the nutritious strength when we see what happens with regard to taste, appetite, ingestion, expulsion, breathing, urine. Let's just say we can medically call this the metabolism. And if there are symptoms related to the generative potency, the whole of sexuality is included. And if there are manifestations symptomatic of being relative to the potential of growing, meaning that potential enables the body to grow to the necessary size, when we find this classification, we apply the two golden rules.
Aplicamos lo que son las dos normas de oro, digamos así, de la metodología.
The first rule in this methodology is that everything man has, all his strengths, have a determined finality.
Es decir, supongamos que el medicamento o el paciente está muy afectado.
Let's suppose that a patient is very affected in his lower limbs. It could be paralysis. We ask ourselves, what is the use of the lower limbs? What is their finality? And what is the finality of their strength and movement? Which is what we see as affected. And then we apply the second rule, which Alan originated. Dr. Allen really says the same thing, that in suffering and illness we must find what factor didn't wish to obey the order of the law of nature. You see, here we've made the transition from the concrete to the metaphysical, because we're relating the symptomatology to the universe, the law, the order. And the first consideration, decide what is the finality of the problem at every level. The second consideration, maybe at first it seems very infantile, to say I'm suffering from this fault, in such an unspecific way.
Aunque parezca infantil, porque en este momento es muy resumido. Como vimos en la vez pasada con Sorinum.
As we saw last time with the Sorinum, we consider something that was or seemed to be infantile, suffering from dirtiness, which I'm guilty of, which I'm sinful about. I'm against cleanliness, and so far we have just one word. Yet how can I be sinful about cleanliness? Now, there's another work based on the methodology, considering. It consists in finding out absolutely and really what we're talking about. How do we find out what we're talking about?
¿Cómo nos enteramos de qué estamos hablando?
We all have an idea of the meaning of the words of a language, but we don't dominate everything that a word means.
Pero no dominamos todo lo que la palabra quiere decir. Entonces,
so, for example, in the names of the themes, I've called one theme love. I have an idea of the meanings of love, but do I know all of its meanings? So the first step of the work is to look in the dictionary and see all the meanings of the word.
Después de interiorizarnos,
after we've assimilated all of the meanings, we increase our knowledge by going to another dictionary, the dictionary of analogies. This reminds us of what I said at the beginning. That the symptom is the thing that the self-experimenter has chosen to express a sentiment. But a different tester or experimenter will use a different word for the same sentiment, while expressing it in an analogous way. So he will use a different word. Also, in this phase of classification in the Thomist anthropological scheme, we look to see if there is symptomatology regarding the different steps of human behavior. That's to say, human behavior has three great phases. The first one relates to the object. But not the object in real, concrete life. It relates to superior values. For example, if I consider that to hate is good or bad, well, the second phase relates to the means to reach finality, the object. The third phase is that of the possession of the object. And each one of these phases, or stages, has 4 steps, in which we find intellect and will alternating. For example, regarding the objective of finality, first comes the intellect, which tells the will that such a thing is good. Then comes the movement of will upon accepting what the intellect says. So intellect and will keep alternating until the final moment arrives, the moment of satisfaction with the object. After we made that study of language, you used first using the language dictionary and then the analogical dictionary. We made what could be called a scientific study of what we're talking about today. Here we refer to a scholastic anthropological book of scholastic psychology. Personally, I'm deeply satisfied by the Manual of Thomas Philosophy. Its didactic is extraordinary. I don't know if it's translated into German, but I wouldn't be surprised. Because, for example, it has more than 20 editions. It was a textbook for years and years, for example, in the French baccalaureate and the law school in Argentina in a Spanish edition. If you can find a copy, I assure you it's a marvel. Maybe the editors of the original French text can give you information. They are the editors Cli in Paris. You could find out from them if it's in a German translation. For example, in this book, apart from what we find about different acceptances of words and their corresponding ideas in anthropology, it even gives us the mechanism of the thing we're studying, the components. For example, it was at this point in my investigation work that things became clear for me regarding lachesis. Because after seeing that one of the great themes of lachesis is love, I proceeded to study that passion of the soul called love. At this point, I came across something that I hadn't known to be a component of love, by which I mean that I knew that love was given in recognition of the value of what one loved, but I didn't know that the other element of love is the proportion of values between the loved object and the lover. In at least some of the values of the loved object, there must exist a proportion with the values of the lover. When we love something that is disproportionate with our own values, the name changes. Now it isn't love. It's called admiration. The attitude of lachesis makes this clear. In reality, there's no search for love, but for admiration. I'm talking to you about the steps of the mythology. Once we've studied all this, we start to try to establish what was the transgression of the mechanism that led to loss, the loss of a certain perfection. And now we start the analysis in what we could call a somewhat capricious way, because I can begin the analysis attempting to understand the symptomatology on a high level, such as mental symptomatology. Or else I can decide to start by attempting to understand the essence of the medicine, its most characteristic and its most noticeable features. Although this could be starting on a lower level, working like this, little by little, you establish the great essential elements of the medicine, generally at a certain moment. You find 2 or 3 beginnings of hypothesis. And now, the work entails seeing how you can relate them so as to find just one hypothesis. So far in this good methodology, we've left something aside, though it may be the most characteristic aspect. That's to say, the symptoms of the imagination, because these symptoms are the most symbolic of all. So to understand them or find out what they're about, I have to look at symbolism, and the symbols have different meanings in such a way that if I look at them too soon, of the 3 or 4 meanings of a symbol, I'm going to capriciously choose the one I like best, which is rather like what happens and what I criticize and what I fear can happen in study groups. Because I see a lot of craziness. Of course, it's more fun and more easy to do this work by consulting a book of symbols that represent something. It's a pleasure. And this is why symbolism has to be left to the end, to confirm or to enrich the hypothesis. I gave you an example with the coprophagia, or of alumina, that when I made efforts to understand it at a point in my studies, I looked at symbology and found that in accordance with the logical hypothesis, the corresponding paragraph was about only one aspect and not more. If I'd started by looking at the symbology of excrements, for example, I could have assimilated that one meaning and led myself astray. One basically leaves symbols as a confirmation. It's rather like what happens when you choose a symbol and start to give it a meaning in itself. Now please note, I'm not only criticizing study groups, I'm including myself in my own work and hypotheses before I'd completed and improved the methodology. Then, for example, I can't tell you if what Price says about alumina was what I said or what others said. Or if this work was really done by me. But before the methodology had been perfectly determined, I can't make use of it. For example, in Luton's repertory of themes and hypotheses, there are cases where Luton specifies this is a Masi hypothesis, are an AFDH hypothesis, or one from a Swiss group. But unfortunately, he doesn't give his sources for all his details of Illumina. I suppose that in the urge to write, things get left halfway and without it being explained how conclusions are reached.
Dejan por la mitad las cosas y no muestran cómo llegaron a eso. Por ejemplo,
in Illumina, for example,
empieza diciendo sensación de
he starts by referring to the sensation of the precariousness of existence, the dream of the sinking ship. And I wonder, if I were the reader, if I might ask myself, is it really the sinking ship dream? He talks exclusively of the truly precarious aspect of existence. He ought to state where he got that dream interpretation from, so that we can decide if we agree with it or not. On the other hand, remember that when we raised the theme of copper phragia, I gave you a literal quote from the Dictionary of Symbols, where in excrements there's a paragraph referring to copper phragia, where it says this, that, and the other, and confirms my theory. After the symbology, we come to everything else we can study. Substances, physico-chemical properties, crystallography, if it's a plant, where it lives. Of course, this is the work of Paracelso, who expresses his knowledge of similitude about plants. But the problem is that Paracelso's signature doesn't come from any pathogenesis, it comes from his definition. He told us his ideas, looking at something and describing it, but he can be wrong. When I ask if what's the advantage of the pathogenesis in itself or the signature, there's no dictionary of symbols. Now, with all this work, the absolute goal is to establish if it's legitimately the human strength of expression. And what divine equivalent of this strength was desired? Upon reaching this point, we study the Summa Theologica, where we study and acknowledge human strength, and everything that refers to the divine attribute. Then we can go back and do a revision of our previous work, to understand it even more clearly, because St. Thomas is very specific in everything he tells us. I can give you an example. I don't know if it's in Luton. Look at the case of ammonium carbonicum. We look at this and find two aspects, both of which we saw as much in the mental as in the somatic spheres. To resume, we saw a problem of judgment. But just like what happened in the case of the coprophagia of alumina, we still had to study a very important theme in ammonium carbonicum. And we couldn't unite this. It was a secret theme which can't keep a secret. So I searched and searched in what we could call the normality of man. There could be a secret whose discovery may determine all these sufferings. I went to look in the Summa Theologica and found a description of the secret. I found it. Man shouldn't know if he's predestined to save himself or if he's predestined to condemn himself. So here a hypothesis arose and it was unified, and it's predestination, which is to say that beyond what God has done, man can be saved or condemned according to God's judgment. One could understand that clearly now. Why is ammonium carbonicum punished in the loss of its judgment? By which I mean when it says what it doesn't want to say and doesn't say what it should say. Something dismissed as being without importance. The human condition, on reaching a decision made by its judgment, using a series of valuations. On the other hand, to my human eyes, and in the eyes of any man, this doesn't happen with God's judgment. Because a person who has acted badly, at least according to our human judgment, is saved by God without any valuation of such things. So there is a difference between God's judgment and human judgment. It acts as it chooses without any justification. This strengthened the whole hypothesis, making it very clear, clarifying the whole theme of judgment. It was confirmed, even if man on all levels expresses his own drama with the language appropriate to his level. Because the same mental problem of not being able to say what it should say while saying what it shouldn't say, we see on an intestinal or digestive level in general, where what should be conserved is eliminated and what should be eliminated is conserved. So, to continue with our ammonium carbonicum, since I have reached this deep understanding of this genius of medicines, I'm now not interested in the symptoms that the patient might demonstrate to me. I mean to say that whenever he has a problem of judgment, which is when I prescribe him ammonium carbonicum, although he may not have symptoms, it's still a great medicine. To confirm the existence of popular knowledge, one of the symptoms is very objective. One of the very objective symptoms is that the mouth is permanently full of water. And you know the Italians, when one tells another a secret that must not be repeated, they say water in the mouth, agua y boca. I don't know where this expression came from, but we can say that the man who can't keep a secret gets his mouth full of water. There's a part of Thomas de Aquino where you can look if in the symptomatology one could find justification for what is said, where he says that he has the impression that it's another person who looks through his eyes, another person who he hears for him. The consciousness is out of the body. I think there's been confusion about Illumina. No, I won't criticize or blame anyone, but at first sight I get the impression that, to put it simply, what Illumina has rejected is to be a second cause. Of course, man is a second cause too. God gives him part of his plan so that man may finish it. And then, for example, we get all those symptoms of the imagination, that someone else sees through his eyes, that someone else hears through his ears, that his consciousness is out of his body. I get the sensation that man has wrongly believed, or has not believed, that he's God's intermediary for getting things done. Consider this, thinking that the problem is in the difference between the first cause and the second cause, has had us thinking of the theme of the knife, because the symbology of the knife is the active principle on inert material. On the other hand, if we see that what has to be modeled is clay, clay is easy to handle, you can do anything you want with it. So clay, a knife. Clay is an elemental figure of raw material. So for all these imaginations, it seems that what's revealed is an appropriation of God's body and individuality. That's to say, God uses me to do the things that he decides. So I'm the second cause and not the first cause. To put it briefly, I have the impression that the mistaken vision of Illumina is that of feeling itself wrongly used by God. Instead of adopting the correct position, and to put it graphically, to be satisfied to be clay in God's hands. Satisfied that God has modeled me as a second cause, to use for his ends. Now we should look and see what potato means in symbology. because the theme of potatoes is important. Patatas in Spanish, papas in Argentina.
Aparece toda una serie de sintomatología que habla de rebelión.
We find a whole series of symptomatology that tells us of the rebellion against a superior force. He doesn't want to bend over. In his nucleus of justification, he says, if I bend over, I'll fall. He can't see the light, meaning he doesn't accept or else is punished for having refused that God can illuminate him so that he does his work well as the second cause. He doesn't accept illumination and he suffers from the light. Note that he also has a theme of necessity, which is to close his eyes. There's a reference to work that he must do, in the theme of tiredness, exhaustion. Even on this level of understanding, we could say, he has constipation because he refused to do something and now he cannot do it. Think, of course, of the theme that we're analyzing, as one could think of the poor intestine, which makes me think of the theme of doing, of what man does as a second cause, and that he needs the help of illumination of the first cause, because if not, he can't do anything. And after that, there's a very interesting theme that we could call the pride of the remedy. The attitude, arrogance, pride, primitiveness, because he can't bend over. Because if he doesn't fall, but at the same time he feels a weight on the occiput of the nape of his neck that obliges him to bend over, it would be as if he were being told what to do. The best thing for you is to bend over, in the light of the first cause. The theme of the potato is very important, because it has so much symptomatology. I don't know its symbolic meaning, though. How do we see the symbology of the potato? I'd like to look for it in the dictionary of symbols if it's included. Now, I'm not sure if Bryce's work is well done. If I've spoken sometimes of Illumina, I don't remember if I referred to his work. But he doesn't use didactic language. The same as I said of Luton. I believe that when we speak of hypotheses, we should use simple language, a layman's language. For example, to follow the analysis that we're doing, the explanation I gave you of a constipation and at the same time of a symptom, this relates to being afraid of divine wrath when doing something, of operating against one's will, and once more, being the second cause. While following St. Thomas, Hahnemann established very clearly in a letter to staff that after we die, our generous Creator will continue to help us in such a way that we're able to perfect our image and will be nearer to God. The idea is that man, let's say internally, has to enhance his condition. In the image of God, because everything is love. Including our relationship with God. And for this to be a real love, there has not to be only knowledge of the value of the loved object, but also a certain proportion between the loved object and the lover. There has to be proportion so that the more we are like God, the more we increase the proportion and can love each other more fully. It is St. Thomas of Aquino who presents this idea in a more religious than philosophical context. So within the referential scheme, if we accept this, because Hahnemann has accepted it, the summary of individual illness at this level of understanding of illness in each human being is given an individual participation in what, for our first father, was the original sin. This means that I'm not Adam, I'm not the head of humanity, but a fragment of it. So I fully inherit the consequences of Adam's sin. Here is the suffering we all receive. Now that we have no integrity. Integrity is having in oneself everything necessary to progress to the maximum, or to totally cure oneself. By losing immortality, we lose integrity and we lose immunity to the things that touch us. We can say that this is the illness that all of us share, the suffering due to our lack of gifts. This provokes existential anguish due to that sensation that at any moment anything can happen to me, and I'm not able to dominate it, I won't be able to handle it. So the individual me, as a small fragment of God, of Adam, chooses an aspect of the original sin. I'm a small fragment of Adam, and at the instant of conception, I read in the imagination inherited from my father the history of all sin, and I say yes, it's fine to wish to be like God, but of all his attributes, the one I like most is this one. He is the one I envy, while I dislike the human potential that is legitimately due to me. It doesn't look like it's worth much to me, and I prefer the equivalent of divinity. Our personality with reference to health and illness is formed around this problem. I mean, if I've wanted to be just, following God's way, or if my life is unbalanced, I'm going to see injustice where there isn't any. This will last all my life, it will last
Pero la
forever,
vivo en salud, es mi vocación.
but I'll live it healthily.
Concretamente, el medicamento que tiene
My
este
precise
problema
vocation is the medicine that corresponds to this problem of justice and compassion, nitricum acidum,
va a ser un magnífico
which
juez,
will produce a magnificent judge, but there will only be happiness
es decir,
when
que
there is
en vez
justice.
de querer ser Dios en totalidad,
That's to say that instead of wanting to be God in a total manner,
tomamos un gran atributo de Dios,
he wants to be
la
God in this way.
providencia de Dios.
We take a great attribute of God, of God's providence.
¿Cómo individualizamos?
We reach this providence by means of many medicines.
Por ejemplo,
To individualize, for example,
¿qué es lo que le importa lo que para
why is calcarea carbonica important for
¿Qué
providence?
es lo importante para Calcaria?
What's important about it?
Calcaria cree que
Calcarea believes that the important thing in providence is that God knows what is going to happen.
lo que va a suceder. Por eso, a tal punto,
God knows to such a point that in the symptomatology,
cuando quiere superar
when we wish to overcome this anguish, the problem of providence may become clairvoyant, exalting the properties for knowing the future. Because this is the important thing, to reach the symptomatology of Calcarea. We have clairvoyance because in its efforts to be like God, it exalts the properties that more or less all of us have to know the future. And not only clairvoyance makes us think that this is the problem, but also we read books on medicine to see what's going to happen. We have to know.
Pero de calcio carbónica especial, ¿hay algo especial de la providencia de calcio carbónico?
Bueno, que para calcárea carbónica la providencia se basa en conocer el futuro. Se basa. Bases.
The providence is based upon knowing the future.
En cambio, tenemos otro remedio, por ejemplo, que también tiene el problema de la providencia, ¿no? Que lo que le importa, lo que le envidia a Dios,
On the other hand,
no tiene que estar
we have another remedy.
Claro, entonces no tiene que
For
estar
example, in the problem of providence, what's important
Es decir, Dios no puede ser
is what we envy God for.
Eso le molesta. Claro,
God doesn't have to be on the alert over what's going to happen.
Entonces,
So he can't be surprised by the appearance of something different from what was expected.
es fisiológico en el hombre. Esto es lo que Gelsenium ha rechazado de su condición humana, ha despreciado él.
Therefore, having to be on the alert is physiological in man, which is what Gelsenium has rejected in man's human condition, and why man has lost his capacity. Observe that in the physical symptomatology, he can't open his eyes. And if you read all the pathogenesis, you will see that he has lost the other condition of being alert. Which is to be physically prepared for action. If you read the scholastic anthropology and the somatic conditions to be ready to act, you'll find all the pathogenesis of Gelsenium. Studying St. Thomas of Aquino's anthropological scheme, we reach the conclusion that what has rejected the condition of veritrum as God's human son and has envied the personality of God's divine Son, has wanted to be Christ. Thus, a symptom as pathological and as material as the compulsion to eat excrement. You were talking of Christ eating excrement. However, with great surprise, we go to the symbolism of excrement. And the Dictionary of Symbols says more or less literally that the copograph's ritual means that the person has wished to substitute the divinity charged with returning man's lost forces or gifts, and also those of his food, the redemption. For those who question my theories and my school, this shows that I'm not imposing a confessional idea, because neither Catholicism or Judaism has any commandment that tells us to eat excrement. That comes from somewhere else. So I mean that when we study the collective unconscious, all cultures and all philosophies think the same when studied in depth. I get there by means of an absolute scheme, Catholic if you like, by Thomas of Aquino. I see a hypothesis to understand this remedy, and I find that the hypothesis is confirmed by absolutely material and organic symptoms in other cultures and in other religions that have nothing to do with this one. What's the practical importance of this? We are badly educated in the practice of profound homeopathy because we're waiting for the patient. We're waiting for the patient to give us a symptom that figures in the repertoire or in the medical material, because the symptom is the way to express a sentiment for last century's self-experimenter, observing a certain culture with a certain family and social history, certain elements, to symbolize what he felt, while today's patient has other symbolic elements, with the result that he now tells me another word that isn't in the repertoire. So when we talk about technique, I'm going to repeat you, I'm going to be very insistent. The whole patient is a symptom. It's not a case of just those that figure in medical matters. We must consider the way the patient dresses, the way he sits, the way he acts, the books he reads. Everything is a symptom. So knowing the hypothesis of the medicines, thanks to this methodology, I can prescribe a medicine even though the patient hasn't given me a single literal symptom of those included in medical works. An example from the repertory would be fear of storms, or another, illusion of being possessed by the devil. This latter case has two medicines. that don't correspond to being afraid of storms. Yet we can use them because demonic possession and fear of storms have the same analogical meaning. So I'm listening to the patient, and I feel that he's repeating a whole life story, a whole series of life interests that aren't related to medical studies. But thanks to the hypothesis, I'm permitted to say that this patient is natrium carbonicum, or phosphorus, etc. Thus the possibilities of solution are amplified by this level of profundity. Let's say that knowledge has changed. Instead of knowing the symptomatology of the medicine, I know the reason for the symptomatology, so that I can recognize what is behind its different symptoms. In short, whether in homeotherapy or in homeopathy, up until today, we've been working phenomenologically. The work I have done offers us a difference, which is that now, as Kant would say, we work numenically, not Kent, but Kant. I mean, the numen is the reason of the phenomenon that we perceive with the senses. How does Kant say numen in German? Is it Latin or Greek?
La definición de noúmeno es, vuelvo a repetir, el factor hipotético que justifica la presentación de los fenómenos.
In any case, I repeat that the definition of numen is the hypothetical factor that justifies the presentation of the phenomena that we perceive with our senses. Behind the phenomenon, we find the factor that provokes it, so that knowing this numen, I can recognize it in the phenomenon. We can call this an analogical symptom, although it may not be identical. That's to say, with this methodology, we can find in every medicine that envy of divinity.
Con lo que se demuestra que compartía el dominio. Allen dice textualmente,
as Allen would say, when demonstrating that he shared Hahnemann's Thomism, beyond the symptomatology of any illness, we can find the symptomatology of an aspect that the law doesn't respect. Thomas of Aquino says for his part that what is finally converted is that aspect of the divine law that didn't wish to obey. Here we can again note Allen as a great homeopath who followed Thomas of Aquino. Here's another confirmation that this isn't fantasy. Once the hypothesis is made, by means of the Thomas scheme, we study the characteristics of the substance in all its aspects. We discover how the substantia of the physico-chemical properties lives, and this confirms the hypothesis. A practical example of the hypothesis of natrium carbonicum indicates there is illness in the patient's harmony. This physico-chemical property of natrium carbonicum is a regulating substance, baca calcum. In fact, there are two substances that can't be mixed in themselves, and natrium carbonicum mixes them. It gives them the harmony that is found in this entity, and what pathogenesis and nature tells us of this substance isn't strange, because this referential Thomas scheme states that the essence of every substance in nature, along with its practical use, has a mission to demonstrate an aspect of God's perfection. So it isn't surprising or unusual that a person suffering an illness originate in envy of an aspect of God's perfection and find their remedy in a natural substance whose most elevated ideal is to demonstrate the same aspect as God's perfection. You don't have to consume the energy. I mean, the dynamized plant with the substance of the remedy, the basic problem of harmony in natrium carbonicum can't be brought to light, isn't cured. But instead of provoking existential anguish, and for greater clarity in the sensations felt by the patient, well, these sensations, these symptomatologies, instead of giving me existential anguish because I don't understand them, they allow me to study myself more perfectly, know myself, accept who I am, and fully exercise my vocation. I'm nitricum acidum. I will be nitricum acidum all my life. I will only find complete peace by administering justice with its corresponding percentage of compassion, which is the theme of nitricum acidum. There will be evolution towards a greater justice, always towards justice and compassion. All medical material is possible in homeotherapy. If I think of phosphorus and cure pneumonia with phosphorus, but the patient is calcarea carbonica, I'm going to cure his pneumonia, not his existential problem, because he isn't phosphorus. In the future, this patient will get a stomach ulcer. Because I didn't cure his miasmatic illness. Thus the motor of pathology continues, and the modalities of the stomach ulcer indicate kali carbonicum to me. I cure the ulcer with kali carbonicum, but that isn't the remedy for his miasmatic illness either. So in the future, this patient may present another clinical entity, which in the vision of homeotherapy could need phytolacca. This could happen from the practical point of view in this game of changing medicine, as indicated by clinical rules and homeotherapy. And one day these modalities will coincide with the patient's real similimum basic remedy. Then I'm surprisingly going to see a very superior result to what I expected. I never expected it, I only wanted to cure the ulcer. Now, to talk about technique, the homeopathic aggravation has two different explanations. One is by Hahnemann. He sustains that the aggravation was exclusively due to the problem of not having given the exact dynamization. Meanwhile, Kant sustains that what we call aggravation is what separates the patient from his state of health. A functional patient is very close to health, so nothing must be aggravated in order to cure him. A patient with rheumatism is further away from health. So, the medicine you give him is more vis medicatrix and will make him a little worse. Here the aggravation is more evident, less close to curing him. The gift of aggravation doesn't depend on the medicine but on the state of the patient. In this apparent opposition between Hahnemann and Kant, Kant doesn't cease to be Hahnemannian because the origin of Kant's idea is in what Hahnemann says. He says it in the preface of the fourth edition of the Organon. He says, true illness is the morbid affectation of the vital force. And what we call illnesses, that's to say clinical conditions, are the very miserable and generally useless efforts that the organism makes in an effort to recuperate good health. On this point, Hahnemann stresses the positive meaning of the pathology, but also he says that there may be no success because of the lack of strength due to the illness. The vital force can't completely overcome the illness, getting only halfway, and failing in nature causes a pathology, the idea of crisis. There is a positive crisis that I mentioned before, namely the one concerned with the gifts that Adam had, and our loss of immortality and immunity, our loss of integrity and infused science. We suppose that when anything injured or traumatized Adam, since he had the gift of integrity, he spontaneously cured himself, al integram. Then we lost integrity, but nature left us remains of it, which are called vis medicatrix naturae. We can see that the meaning is positive, but we haven't sufficient strength to reach the finality. I read a very interesting book that spoke of cancer as an alteration of form. I tried to add this to my homeopathic knowledge from the positive point of view of clinical illness. I asked myself, what does cancer wish to do? What is the benefit for the cancer? It wants to do the same as the protozoarios in negative life conditions. What does the protozoario do in bad life conditions? It divides itself, and this is what cancer wishes to do, to create another organism without being impossible. Causes the illness that will kill us. But Adam didn't have to study, he knew because God had given him knowledge. Let's see this clearly. In man's current state, just as he has been left with some remains of integrity, he also has remains of the science that Adam had. This justifies the collective unconscious. We have these remains, but what happens is that we don't make use of them. They are unconscious. If you study and consider the superficial argumentation in every culture, religion and philosophy, you will see that humanity has always thought that the meaning of a dog is this, the meaning of a horse is that. This is the general knowledge that Jung spoke of. After that, according to his different cultures, man has made use of this. For example, in mythology, the figure of a relevant person, Jung's archetypes. So what is most alive in every human being is the drama, that also has the substance of its own remedy. The anthroposophers have included this, but they have only abstraction to know what a dog means. On the other hand, we homeopaths have pathogenesis, in which the sensitive subjects have given us voice to the substance. Whatever happens with the experimenter's ideas, Drosera is the law of analogy, of similarity. You may consider that having reached these conclusions, I confront the necessity to study St. Thomas of Aquino's enormous philosophy, to study a remedy in accordance with the methodology. But I didn't reach a fully satisfactory conclusion. Yet later, returning to study St. Thomas of Aquino again, I found the remedy. I hadn't realized how it was. It's a flood of things that wash over you and make study difficult. The study of physical and chemical properties is simultaneous to the study of why such a plant grows in such a place, and coincides with the study of what existent folklore has to say about substances. So one has to go into disciplines that as a doctor one never dreamed of studying. One has to start studying them now. The book Medical Homeopathic Material has been written by pupils of mine, who told me that they planned to do it. But didn't send me any text to correct. So I can't tell them if what they write about each remedy is good. If they hadn't understood me, or if they'd written anything I'd never have dreamed of saying. They got very angry when I didn't praise the book in the Frankfurt conference. But I did say the absolute truth. I can't say how good or bad this book is. I don't know yet. I suppose most of it must be fine, because those who wrote it were brilliant pupils. I know they understood my theory, But I can't say if what they write is good, because they've sent me the 2 volumes now, and the damage is done. How long would it take me to have all this translated and corrected? While meanwhile there are people buying it and thinking, this is what Masi says. Secondly, it's important that although the book may be well done, you have to consider that it's a work of current investigation. Which means that apart from those medicines I have classified in the thesis, the majority is hypothesis. So it must be discussed, confirmed or restructured. For example, if I show my approval of one of these medicines to a Thomist or a Thomist philosopher, he can tell me, Masi, you don't understand what St. Thomas says. You've interpreted something that isn't like that. Well, then I have to rectify the image. This must be very clear. It's a work in evolution, and we're going to test this fact when I talk now of alumina. Let's see what conclusion we reach on alumina. We'll see what I think now. In something so new, in something we can truly call so revolutionary, we have to take the evolutionary state into account. So my great fear is that what I haven't personally done, or that what I've done but still feel doubts about, will be taken by people as being my definitive opinion. To have put my name, Dra.Gabrielle Leneutre Alfonso Masi-Elizalde, as if I were the author, it's an abuse. Because after all, in small print, you see Author's Madman Press. I haven't revised this book, though I insist that it could be fine. I know the people involved, and they're good. But I don't know if they understand me. The problem they give me is that I can't say anything, which is what happened in Frankfurt. I don't know if I must say the book is good or bad. No, I didn't revise it. I suppose the authors of the book think it's good, while I personally can't be sure. So I want to make all this clear to you for a basic reason. A basic reason, which is that what first prompted me to revise homeopathy was my horror of the conceptual chaos that I saw in the doctrine. So I'm terrified of adding to the chaos instead of solving it, terrified of the thought that something I have serious doubts about could be taken as being my conclusion. So, what I'm going to do is to take advantage of this compilation that they've published. And if I have collaboration from students in Buenos Aires who speak German, I will study everything again, remedy by remedy, and try to get it all up to date. In any case, so that it's quite clear, I'd like to tell you again. I don't think it's classified in the theses of medicines. But if you have this book, please take it as suggestions for the deeper understanding of medical material. That's perfect. Suggestions. There's natrium carbonicum, nitricum acidum, lycopodium, verutum album, drosera, etc. A lot of medicines that I'm prepared to discuss with anybody. The study has been done in depth, in a satisfactory manner, but there are other medicines that I still have doubts about. I'm not yet disposed to discuss with anybody. My horror is that I know the homeopathic atmosphere, and I've seen that one of the greatest obstacles in the way to clarifying homeopathy is the Magister Dixit. Ken said this, Hahnemann said so too, so it's untouchable. Of course, the problem I had to analyze when I made the revision is explainable. I mean, homeopathy was obscure. If we wanted to discuss it, there were no arguments in it. Hahnemann himself said so. He was a genius. It sounds crazy, but one of the things I'd be most criticized for is my saying that Hahnemann was diametrically wrong. That's what they accuse me of in the other schools. I'm a heretic. I'm heretic and insolent.
Más preguntas.